Wind prowled the cul-de-sac like an animal hunting bone, pressing sleet against the windows of Unit 3B until the old glass rattled in its frame. Maris Quaid stood at the sink of the tiny kitchen with her wrists in soapy water and her knees cold from the linoleum, making dinner from the last of the pantry. Elbow macaroni, a scoop of powdered milk, 2 cubes of bouillon. The apartment smelled like steam and resolve. Her son, Ivo, 6 and solemn, sat at the thrift store table with a box of crayons he'd organized by length, murmuring to himself about which ones still had good tips. The overhead light hummed and blinked like it was deciding whether to give up. Outside, the noise came, low first, like distant thunder, then closer, full of piston and promise. Not one engine, many. The sound gathered itself at the mouth of the cul-de-sac and held there as if considering where to put its weight. Maris dried her hands on a towel that had lost its color in somebody else's house before it found hers, and she felt it, an old reflex waking. Not fear, exactly. A soldier's scan. Where are the exits? Where are the neighbors who will pretend not to see? Where are the hearts beating fast behind thin doors? "Mom?" Iva whispered, the word a thread. She crossed to him and brushed his cowlick with the backs of her fingers, the motion an apology to both of them for the life they had. Taped-up windows, a deadbolt that stuck in the winter, calendars full of shifts that paid just enough to keep the lights mostly on. She thought of the rent notice folded in her coat pocket like a paper splinter. She thought of Elise in apartment 3A, who always knew the gossip first. She thought of Pastor Reuben's voice saying, "The good we get to do is rarely tidy." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The sound outside cut, went sudden quiet, and left only wind and the pinging of metal cooling down. Maris stepped to the peephole and found nothing but the warped fisheye of the walkway. Then 3 knocks, deliberate, spaced like someone counting. The hallway light stuttered to life as she opened the door on its chain. A woman stood there in a wet leather jacket with a white scar cutting her eyebrow into 2 dark islands. Behind her, down the stairs, the open doors of the building breathed in cold and exhaled breath that wasn't theirs. The woman's cheeks were blotched red from the weather. Her voice came steady, but frayed at the edges, like rope that had seen hard use. "We've got a kid who's shaking and a radiator that won't warm a postage stamp. I'm not here to bother you, ma'am, but the baby's lips are going purple and the clinic's closed and we need a place to sit with heat for the night." Maris felt the words drop through her like stones. Kid, shaking, purple. She saw past the woman to the stairwell where 2 silhouettes hovered. A man whose beard was more weather than hair, holding a swaddled bundle, and a teenage girl hugging her arms so tight around herself that her knuckles flashed bone. Behind them, through the open doors at street level, the parking lot was a constellation of chrome under sodium light, bikes angled like a row of shoulders, patches on jackets she did not need to read to understand. "You're with the Angels," she said before she could stop herself. The woman nodded, and something like pride and apology crossed her face in the same heartbeat. "Name's Magda. We were headed south before the storm kicked up ice instead of rain. It doesn't have to be long, just long enough to warm the little one. You can hold my cut if that makes you feel better." She was already shrugging out of the leather, and in that movement, Maris saw more than the patch. She saw the way Magda's fingers trembled, caught herself thinking, she could be me under a different set of stars. Ivo had edged to the doorway, the top of his head barely as high as the latch. "Is there a baby?" he asked, with the kind of soft hunger kids have for other small lives.
Maris unhooked the chain. "Shoes off," she said, because rules kept shape when nothing else did. "And just you 3. If anybody else comes in here without asking, I'll call the cops first and God second. Magda's laugh was quiet and grateful. Fair. She turned and made a small gesture that meant stay to the shoulders waiting at the bottom of the stairs, then ushered the two shapes up. The bearded man climbed slowly, careful with the bundle like gravity was extra today. The teenager avoided eye contact the way street kids do, all chin and bravado around a secret that could break them. Heat rose from the little apartment like it was alive and curious about visitors. Maris took the baby, because some things you don't hesitate to do if you've ever wanted someone to do them for you. She slid her hands under the swaddle and felt weight, that miracle of proof that the world had agreed, at least once, to make something good. The baby was light and hot-cold at the same time, fever and chill married in the damp curls at his temple. His eyes were slow to track. The purple that had scared them was more dusk than night, but it was moving in the wrong direction. Bathroom, Maris said, already thinking steam. We'll run the water hot. Sit on the lid and hold him upright. I've got a thermometer that only sometimes lies. The man nodded, swiping a hand over his face like he could tame the day if he just pressed hard enough. I'm Bram, he said, which sounded like a name that had grown out of steel and cold mornings. This is my girl, Kestrel. The teen flicked her chin in a hello that meant don't make me say more. Maris shepherded them toward the small, clean bathroom with the hand-drawn fish stickers Evo had arranged along the tile. Steam rose quick. The mirror bloomed fog. Her own face blurred, which felt like relief. She showed Bram how to cradle the baby's chest so the ribs had room to do their work, then went back to the kitchen to set a kettle to boil, because hot water multiplies the will to live, and she needed more of that in the air. Magda drifted at the edge of the counter, looking like a storm in a doorway. You're doing this without questions, she said. I'm not. I'm doing it with questions later. She bit the paper triangle from the corner of a tea bag and shook dried leaves loose into the pot like seeds. You have any Tylenol, infant dose? Yeah. Magda's hand went into her jacket like it had known it would be asked. She set a little bottle beside the stove, and for a heartbeat, the kitchen became a pharmacy built on trust. Evo climbed onto the counter with the cat's permission and sat there swinging his feet, eyes huge, mouth a straight line because he decided to be brave. Can I help? You can be in charge of the quiet. That's a big job. He nodded, understanding the promotion, and tucked his hands under his thighs so they wouldn't do anything extra. Down the stairwell, the building spoke, scrapes of boots turning to whispers as the strangers organized themselves into cold. A door clicked. Somewhere, a neighbor's television muttered canned laughter at a joke it had heard before. Footsteps stopped outside 3B and didn't enter. Boundaries had been set and were being respected. Maris felt her shoulders ease a fraction and then tense again at the thought of Elise in 3A placing her ear like a stethoscope to the paper-thin wall. She carried 2 mugs to the bathroom and found Bram humming tunelessly through tight lips, the way men do when they want noise they can call accidental. The baby, Lark, Kestrel supplied in a reluctant half-smile, breathed easier in the wet heat. Color started to creep back, like someone turning up a dimmer. Maris passed the Tylenol to Bram and counted quietly with him, 1 drop for every 5 pounds. How old? 8 months. His eyes flicked up. Thank you. The words were too small for the room, but he said them like he meant each letter. Keep him upright a while more. Then we'll wrap him dry and borrow a sweatshirt for a blanket. Evo's got one that's soft. The hallway outside the bathroom had a narrow view of the world, a sliver of window that just managed to catch the corner of the lot where the bikes waited like a pack told to stay. Through the glass, snow turned to sleet, turned to needle rain, turned to a kind of weather that looked like punishment. Maris imagined engines cooling, hands shoved into pockets, jokes told to keep teeth from knocking together. She had the oddest urge to go down with a plate of macaroni and tell the cold to stand back. She didn't. She went to the living room and moved the space heater closer to the couch, aware of how much that would remember on the power bill. Magda stood with her hands open, as if waiting for orders she'd never accept in daylight. Shoes by the mat, Maris said again, because rules were a comfort for everyone. And you can hang your jacket on the chair, not the door, it sticks. Magda smiled with the side of her mouth. You live like a field medic. I live like a person who has learned what goes wrong, Maris said simply. She thought of the landlord who fixed nothing. She thought of the hospital bill that had arrived like a fall of knives after Ivo's ear infections last winter. She thought of the voicemail from her ex. The silence always lasted exactly as long as a promise, then cut out. Do people here know how to mind their business? Magda asked, glancing at the ceiling as a pipe clanged. They know how to mind the parts that concern them. Everything else they narrate for sport. The bathroom door opened. Brahm emerged with Lark, who now wore a pink flush and a damp curl against his forehead that looked like permission to breathe. Kestrel hovered behind them, hands stopping and starting in the air like she wanted to be useful and was afraid of breaking usefulness itself. You can take the couch, Maris said, pushing at the cushions with her knee as if a little kindness would make them softer. Kestrel, you can have the chair. It reclines if you don't ask it a lot. Kestrel finally met her eyes. You're sure? It wasn't a teenager's challenge. It was a person making sure the kindness was a real thing and not a test. I am, Maris said. You'll be here where I can see you, and my son can sleep. That matters. Magda exhaled like she'd been borrowing air from other people and could finally use her own. We'll be ghosts, Dawn and Regan. Dawn felt like a country on the far side of a war, but Maris nodded anyway. She turned out the kitchen light to save the bulb's life and left the stove clock to be the moon. Ivo crawled into the bedroom on hands and knees because he was practicing stealth, and Maris followed, closing the door until it was almost shut, the familiar narrow of light making a blade on the carpet. Are they bad guys? Ivo asked into the dark. He always saved heavy questions when the world went quiet and the heart had to reply without the help of chores. They're people who ride fast and make noise and wear jackets with patches. Tonight, they're people with a sick baby. That's the part we're dealing with. He considered this, then burrowed into her side, with his little spine a string of warm knots. Okay. Sleep took them and gave them back in fragments. Maris awoke to the sound of something shifting in the living room and found with that waking the old reflex again. Inventory the dangers, then the mercies. Her feet met the cold floor first. She slid from the bed and stood in the door to see Brahm asleep with Lark on his chest, his hand cupped over the baby's back like a story about what hands are for. Kestrel had disappeared into the chair and become a tangle of limbs and borrowed blanket. Magda sat upright at the far end of the couch with her eyes closed and her mouth set, like a guard who knew that the thing she was watching for always arrived when lids got heavy.
Maris turned away so she would not cry at the sight of people guarding each other's sleep. In the kitchen, she measured coffee like a ritual. 4 scoops for a pot, 1 extra for mercy. The smell stitched its way into the apartment's corners. Magda's eyes opened before the machine finished the first ragged drip. She moved quiet, as if afraid the light would notice and charge rent. You don't have to give us anything more, she said. We've taken the night and you're warm and I won't take your morning too. You can borrow a cup, Maris said. Bring it back when it's empty. She poured into a cracked mug, printed with a cartoon sun that had not smiled this way in real weather. Magda wrapped both hands around it and closed her eyes for the first sip like prayer. I'll square this, Magda said, eyes still closed. I don't know what form it'll take yet, but I will. I keep my ledgers clean. I don't need... Maris started, then stopped because that wasn't true. She needed a dozen things, and the list ran under every second of her day like a subtitle. I need a new radiator, and a landlord who doesn't pretend emails are a myth, and a job that cuts shifts thin when the weather turns. She laughed once, short. But a thank you is already something. Magda opened her eyes and looked at Maris as if measuring and finding she preferred the answer when it was difficult. We are not a church, but we have our own kind of tithe. Snow degraded to rain around dawn. The building's bones popped inside as temperature decided which fight to lose.
Bram woke with a start that spilled into an apology, then relaxed when he found all the living things accounted for. Lark played with a thread on Bram's shirt and made a sound like a hinge opening. Kestrel blinked herself back into personhood, then sat straighter when she saw Maris at the stove, scrambling the last 3 eggs into a skillet with a slice of onion that had not decided to go soft yet. "You don't have to," Maris said again, which meant thank you so big it couldn't fit past the teeth without disguise. "I know," Maris said. "I want to. It's good to start a day by proving to yourself you can." They ate in the careful quiet of morning after a storm, the kind that suggests the day might still decide to be kind. Words showed up and didn't ask much of each other. "Thank you. Here, take the bigger slice." The baby's color looked like a promise that might keep. Near 8, the building woke up in earnest. Pipes cleared throats. Radios climbed in volume. Doors learned opinions. The first knock came at 8:12. Not the gentle, counted kind from the night, but a staccato that meant righteousness. Maris wiped her hands on a dish towel that had served other lives and went to the door. Elise stood there in a robe the color of old toothpaste, hair pinned and mouth already forming the shape of neighborly concern as performance. "I heard voices and the motorcycles. I just want to make sure everything is appropriate." She rolled the last word in sugar until it chipped a tooth. "It's appropriate," Maris said. "There's a sick baby and a storm. They're leaving." Elise's eyes flicked past her shoulder. The patch on Magda's jacket might as well have been a siren. "You can't bring that here. It isn't safe. What if they come back? What if they bring trouble?" She glanced down the hallway like trouble had a schedule to keep. Maris thought of the list in her pocket labeled bills, and the other list unlabeled that lived in the ache below her ribs. She thought of how fear makes people generous with rules and selfish with mercy. She kept her voice level. "They brought a cold baby and their own coffee. They'll take both out with them." Elisa's mouth softened, sharpened. "If the manager sees bikes, he'll call, and child services." She let it dangle, the way some people do when they like to see other people pick up the fear themselves. "I hear you," Maris said, which meant, "I don't agree. We're done here soon." She closed the door before Elise could audition more worry. Back in the living room, the mood shifted the way rooms do when a cold wind sneaks under the sill. Kestrel pulled her knees up hard enough that her bones complained. Bram held Lark closer, and Magda's jaw set. "If your neighbors want quiet, we can be quiet fast," Magda said. She stood, the mug ring she left on the table a small, imperfect circle like a vow. Maris shook her head. "Give it 20 minutes," she said. "The roads will hate you less. Let me pack something for the ride." She didn't have much to pack, but she had hands, and hands could turn little into enough. She wrapped 2 foil packets of macaroni in a dish towel to keep them warm and heavy, and then peeled an orange into a perfect spiral because she needed one beautiful thing in the day.
When they stepped into the hall, the air had that clean, metallic taste mornings get after a night when the weather and the world both consider starting over. Down the stairs, the open doors framed the lot like the edge of a stage. The bikes were there, unmoved, steam faint from exhausts. Men and women at their posts like sentinels. Laughter condensed into puffs. Heads turned when Magda, Bram, Kestrel, and the bundle appeared with Maris behind them, a small procession made of practical graces. The first man to step forward wore years like armor. He handed Magda her cut without looking away from Maris, then tipped his chin once in a gesture that held more grammar than a paragraph. "We're square?" he asked. But it wasn't a question about money. "We're human," Maris said. He considered that, then nodded as if she'd given the right password to a door he'd forgotten he'd locked. "Name's Wrench," he said, as if to admit that names in this world were both joke and jurisdiction. "You need anything? You ask for Magda and say Wrench said it's your turn to ask." "I don't know where to ask," Maris said, which was true in more ways than one. "You will," Magda said, slinging the jacket onto her shoulders in one practiced motion that took her from guest to force. Engines started as if called to prayer. The lot filled with noise that pushed back against the morning's smallness. Ivo at the top of the stairs covered his ears and grinned.
because some sounds scare you and fix you at the same time. Lark made a noise that could have been delight or protest. Babies had a way of naming both with the same syllable. They were in motion then. Kicks, throttles, turns so coordinated you could read respect in tire tracks. The column rolled to the street. Wrench raised 2 fingers at Maris, without smiling, which felt like its own kind of blessing. Magda tapped her heart with 2 knuckles and pointed once at 3B's window, a small sign that said ledger in a language without receipts. By the time Maris and Ivo climbed back to the apartment, the lot had settled into the quiet, particular to places that have just held something larger than they were built for. She shut the door and leaned her back against it, and only then did she let her knees register the morning. Ivo climbed her like a small tree and wrapped himself around her middle. "We did good," he said into her sweatshirt. "We did right," she said, which is sometimes the same thing, and sometimes not, but today she needed it to be both. She had exactly 26 minutes before she had to leave for her lunchtime shift at the grocery, where she wore a name tag and patience like twin shields. She changed into jeans that knew better days and slipped the rent notice back into her pocket like a problem she'd pretend was a talisman. She braided her hair tight enough to keep the wind from undoing it. She kissed Ivo's head and told him to listen to Miss Rada downstairs if he needed anything, then locked the door and walked into a morning that remembered how to shine. The shift ran like a small river, steady, cold at the wrists. People bought milk like it could prevent regret. They bought bread like insurance. They bought the cheap cereal with the cartoon pirate because salt and sugar made loud children quiet and soft children brave. Maris smiled with the parts of her face that didn't cost as much to use. She waited for the moment when the universe would remind her it hadn't forgotten to be itself. It came at 2:17 p.m., when the store manager, Mr. Cagle, a man with a tie that always looked like it wanted to run away from his neck, called her to the back office and closed the door like it was a coffin lid. He folded his hands on the desk as if praying to the god of paperwork. "We've had a call," he said, "about you, about your visitors from last night." He didn't meet his eyes, instead straightening a stack of forms that had been straight before he touched them. Maris felt the old inventory spin up again. Dangers, then mercies. From whom? Ere Iva would appear any second, at the door that led to her small kingdom, at the parking lot blooming with the impossible generosity of 100 engines. He cleared his throat. "A concerned resident said you were harboring elements." He let the word do the dirty work. "Said they saw motorcycles outside your building and that you brought those people here." He gestured vaguely at the whole town. "We can't have that." "They were cold," Maurice said. "There was a baby." "I'm sure you have a good heart," he said, which is always what people say before they tell you your heart is a problem. "But we have a brand, and our insurance. If something were to happen—" "What's happening is you're cutting my hours," Maurice said, because she could see the shape of the sentence before it came out of his mouth. Predicting cruelty didn't make it easier to swallow, but it kept you from choking. He winced like she'd skipped ahead in a script he wanted to deliver slowly. "Just for a week or two, until things settle." He smiled without his eyes. "Consider it time to rest." He slid a paper across the desk, a list of new schedules with her name reduced like a sauce left too long on a burner. She looked at the numbers and did quiet math with the kind of precision that makes your stomach cold. "Thanks for letting me know," she said, and stood. Back on the floor, the noise of scanners and small talk felt like it belonged to a planet where she did not currently have citizenship. She put items into bags and told people to have a good day, and meant it, because she wished it for them with the hunger of someone who had not been offered one. When the clock finally turned its face toward 5, she signed out and stepped into air so clear it felt like a lie. The walk home took 7 minutes at a tired pace. Each crack in the sidewalk had a story about winters and neglect and the way things break where pressure insists. Maurice climbed the stairs with a bag of bruised apples the manager would not miss, and a loaf of day-old bread wrapped like a consolation prize. She could hear Ivo inside talking to his dinosaurs about how bravery is not the same as loudness. She was 3 steps from her door when a woman with a clipboard and a smile that had passed its certification test stepped into the hall. "Maurice Quaid?" she asked, the question smooth as pre-recorded. "Yes," Maurice said, putting her keys into her palm like they could become knuckles if necessary. She extended a card. "I'm with Family and Child Services. We had a call." She said it the way people say, "We found a leak," like the problem was with the pipes and not with the person holding the wrench. Behind Maurice, the stairwell filled with a sound that didn't belong to her world at all. It came first like weather, then like music, then like a country arriving from the far side of the map. Engines, dozens of them, rounding the corner of the block and filling the cul-de-sac in a wave of chrome and roar that made the building shiver. The caseworker glanced past Maurice, the professional smile faltering as the first bikes rolled into view like a thundercloud deciding to be seen. Helmets came off, faces turned up to the third-floor windows. One by one, kickstands dropped like stakes claimed in gravel. Seats were loaded with sacks, boxes, crates, paper bags brimming with groceries, diapers, firewood, blankets rolled and cinched, cans stacked like bricks. Magda eased her bike to the curb, boots planting like she'd rehearsed this entrance in another lifetime. Wrench came behind her, flanking with a quiet that made the noise louder. The lot became a choreography, hands passing parcels, bodies moving with the efficiency of people who have practiced rescue, even when the world called it something else. The caseworker turned back to Maurice, her clipboard tilting. "Miss Quaid," she said, voice thinner now. "Do you know these people?" Maurice looked at the stairwell where engines were idling like hearts. She felt the day gather itself, the way a body does before a sprint or a prayer. "Yes," she said. "They came for the baby." Down in the lot, Magda lifted her hand. 100 bikes answered by revving once, just once, like a single word pronounced by many mouths. The sound knifed through the thin afternoon and left the building ringing with it. Maurice opened her door, aware of the caseworker's eyes, aware of Elise's, aware of every window on the block waking up like a hive. She stepped into the living room and set the bag of bruised apples on the table that had seen more meals of hope than meals of abundance. She looked at Ivo as his face went wide with the sound of Calvary and wonder. "Stay by the window. Watch." Outside, the line of bikes kept building, the sidewalk filling with the rustle of paper and the thud of boxes. The caseworker cleared her throat behind Maurice, found the rest of her training, and said carefully, "We still need to talk about last night, about safety and judgment." Maurice turned back to her with a calm she had to build from spare parts. "We will. But first..." A crash downstairs cut her sentence in half, a bottle shattering, then a man's shout from the street. "Hey, off our block!" The voice didn't belong to the Angels. It belonged to a group of boys who wore threat like cologne, who had decided sometime last summer that the cul-de-sac was theirs to patrol. The apartment's thin glass vibrated with the words that followed, the kind you fungle to cover a child's ears from and then realize there's not enough hands in the world. Maurice felt the apartment inhale. Outside, Magda swung her leg off the bike slow, like a fuse deciding whether to be fire or wire. Wrench rolled his shoulders. And then a squad car turned the corner with its light silent and its posture hungry, drawn by the same phone calls that had sent the caseworker to Maurice's door. Engines growled, voices rose, the apartment seemed to tilt, every cup and picture frame at the same precarious angle. Maurice stepped closer to the window and splayed her fingers on the glass. The caseworker lifted her pen like it might become a wand. Outside, a bottle skittered under a boot and cracked open a river of milk across the asphalt. A boy in a hood reached into his pocket. An officer's hand went to his belt. Magda took a step. Wrench lifted a palm that meant hold. 100 bikes idled like thunder, deciding whether to leave. Maurice opened her door, aware of the caseworker's eyes, aware of Elise's, aware of every window on the block, waking up like a hive. And then, the boy's hand came out of his pocket, holding.
This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. A phone with a cracked screen. The boy froze like he'd reached into someone else's pocket by mistake. The officer's hand hovered at his belt, suspended between training and the sudden ridiculousness of danger dissolving into a rectangle of glass. Maris let out a breath she didn't know she'd been hoarding. The caseworker's pen drooped. Below, Magda didn't blink. She held the moment together by refusing to move. "Hands," the officer called, voice taut, but stepping down the stairs of panic one rung at a time. The boy lifted his palms, the phone clunking to the pavement, screen flashing a polite insistence that it needed a passcode more than it needed to be part of a near disaster. Wrench turned his head an inch toward the squad car. "We're not here for a scene," he said. Even. "We're here for a delivery." He tipped his chin to the crates of groceries and bundles of blankets stacked like a pop-up supply line. From the nest of bikes, movement. Riders peeled off in pairs, each carrying sacks reader-boarded with store logos Maris recognized from every aisle she'd ever faced. Pete's Market, Sunrise Co-op, even a butcher's paper stamp she couldn't afford to pronounce out loud. Maris caught the boy's eye, the one with the phone, and didn't try to shame him into being small. "You got a little brother?" she asked, as if there were only two types of boys in the world, those who had been somebody's big and those who needed one. He nodded, throat tight. "Yeah." "Good," she said. "Help us carry the diapers. Show him what it looks like when men do useful loud." Someone laughed, the kind that takes the lid off a pot before it boils. The officer's shoulders dropped a fraction. His partner's hand left the buckle. The boys, 4 of them, with hoods, fierce for the cameras they didn't have, looked at each other and then at the crates like they'd been offered a riddle with only one true answer. 2 stepped forward, then all 4 did, because bravery is contagious and so is relief. Maris opened her door wide to the hall. "3rd floor," she called down, the words riding the banister like they'd trained for this day. "Stairs are mean. Boxes are heavier than they look. Watch the corner by the radiator. It bites." The caseworker blinked, recalibrating in real time. "Miss Quaid," she began, reaching for a script that made sense yesterday. "We should still." "We will," Maris said gently. "You can even carry a bag while we talk." She handed the woman a sack of rice that immediately made the clipboard seem ornamental. What followed was choreography that hummed with purpose. Boots on steps, paper rasping against coats. Ivo stationed himself by the front window, her small herald with a view, counting the bikes in a whisper like a spell to keep bad luck out. 31, 32, 89, 90. He lost track and started again, grinning at the impossibility of numbers that big. Magda took the first load up, breath steady, eyes on the hallway like she'd memorized its complaints overnight. She set boxes by the kitchen doorway, pasta, beans, tins of tomatoes, a bottle of olive oil too fancy for this apartment, and therefore exactly right. Next came diapers, wipes, formula, a pair of small fleece sleepers someone had tucked on top like a joke the universe finally told back. Elise from 3A opened her door to the noise, lips prepared to reprimand, and saw instead a procession of provisions that would feed half the building for a week. She froze with a curlers and coffee expression that softened into something almost human when Kestrel, face open, arms full of baby blankets, said, "Ma'am," with a sincerity only teenagers can weaponize unintentionally. Well, if you need to use my table to sort, we will," Maris said before she could talk herself out of it. "Thank you." And that was how the hallway turned into a pantry, and Elise's doily-edged table hosted stacks of canned beans like a communion. The officer approached Wrench at the curb,
their conversation pitched low enough to keep it from becoming theater. Wrench stayed steady. The officer's gaze did a sweep, patches, faces, the neat formation of bikes that suggested order more than threat. Finally, he tipped his head toward the building, toward Maris, toward the immediate proof that sometimes noise arrives as help. "Keep it peaceful," he said. It wasn't surrender. It was a pact. Then the squad car rolled away, leaving behind tire marks and a story the neighborhood would retell in embellished circles.
By the time the last crate found the top landing, the hallway smelled like coffee, garlic, rain-damp leather, and that clean note newspaper has when it hasn't yet learned the world. Magda used a pocket knife to slit open boxes and stacked items with the logic of a field quartermaster. Wrench oversaw the bike line like a foreman whose material was goodwill and gasoline. Bram, carrying Lark in a snug wrap against his chest, took a corner of Maris's kitchen and turned it into an assembly station, bagging sacks of flour into manageable parcels, writing dates on milk with a marker he'd borrowed from the caseworker who now held a baby's bottle like it might help her understand policy. "Miss Quaid," she said at last, quiet, as if admitting the truth at conversational volume might break it. "About last night, the report said you invited unknown adults into your home while your child was present." Maris wiped her hands on her jeans and met the woman's eyes. "I invited a freezing baby into my bathroom and 2 adults who carried him. I set rules. I watched. I slept by the door. I made decisions I could defend to my son and myself in the morning." She gestured to the living room, where groceries had formed a kind of altar. "And this is the morning." The caseworker looked at Ivo, tucked by the window, at the stacks of food, at Magda's careful parade of order. Her training spoke in her posture. Boundaries, safety, risk assessment. So did something older that wore her grandmother's voice. "You'll let me come by this week," she said. Not a threat, a request dressed in official fabric. "You can come," Maris said, "but not to catch me, to learn the radiator's trick and how the lock sticks and where the mold hides so you can write a request that the landlord can't ignore." She let a smile in, small and tired. "Bring boxes. We'll send you home with soup." The woman surprised herself by smiling back. "I might," she said, and tucked the clipboard under her arm in a way that made it smaller. Outside, a horn tooted twice, more clown than alarm. Heads turned, a delivery van edged into the curb, the driver hanging his arm out like he'd been waiting his whole life to be part of a story that required an entrance. "Donation?" he called up the stairwell, hoisting a produce crate high enough for the building to identify its contents. Apples so red they looked like they'd been painted by a holiday committee, onions with papery skins that sounded like good news, and greens still wearing the farm. "From whom?" Wrench asked, taking the crate like it weighed less than a favor. The driver shrugged toward the horizon. "Lady named Rhoda called it in, said her little neighbor was feeding half the block." He grinned. "Didn't say which one." Ms. Rhoda from 2C stepped into the hallway just in time to pretend to be shocked by her own generosity. "You can't prove it," she said to Maris, eyes twinkling. "But if someone wrote your name on the order, they spelled it right." The next hour turned the building inside out. Neighbors who had never learned each other's names traded recipes and extension cords. The boys with the hoodies discovered that carrying 2 sacks of potatoes at once impressed precisely the people they wanted to impress, and not a single cop. Elise's apartment saw more laughter than it had in years, which startled her fake ficus to looking almost real. Ivo learned to say torque and carburetor because Wrench explained the difference like it was important for 6-year-olds to have precise nouns. Maris's chest loosened notch by notch, like a belt after a long day of breath held too tight. She kept moving because that was how she understood joy, through action, through things becoming sorted where previously there had only been piles of worry. At noon, Magda tugged on her sleeve and nodded toward the parking lot. The bikes had been lined up again, nose to tail now, neat as a drill team, with a folding table set on milk crates in front of them. On it lay tools and hoses and a pair of space heater-sized radiators. "You mentioned a heater," Magda said.
We're not good at paperwork, but we're very good at hot air. Wrench barked a laugh at his own expense. Well, let us fix your radiator, the loud way. Maris hesitated. Pride is a tender thing when help shows up wrapped in leather. Then she thought of Ivo's blue fingers on morning school days. Okay, she breathed. Please.
For 3 hours, the lot turned into a shop. A legal one, if Improv had a license. They bled the line. They flushed rust from pipes that had been colored with neglect since a prior tenant tried to dry a wet towel with hope. They replaced a valve with a spare Wrench swore fit most honest machines. Magda cut away rotted tape and resealed a seam with the kind of patience that qualifies as affection. When the heat finally rose through the apartment with a steady, even confidence, no rattles, no whistles, just warmth arriving like a decision, Maris put her hand to the radiator and felt tears find work to do. She didn't let them fall. She pressed her palm to iron and thought, this is what a second chance sounds like. Quiet, consistent, on time. The caseworker stood with her coat unbuttoned, cheeks pink from honest weather, holding a clipboard that had given up trying to be in charge. I'll write this up, she said, almost to herself. Differently. Write this, Ms. Rada suggested, bustling past with a pot so large it required both arms. Community active. Child thriving. Building knows its own name again. By late afternoon, the bikes began to peel away, small clusters heading to shifts and obligations and roads that needed righting. Each one left lighter by a sack and heavier by a story. The boys with the hoodies hung back near the stairs, suddenly shy without the cover of adrenaline. The smallest kicked at a pebble. Maris crouched to be eye level. What's your brother like? The kid considered. Loud, but he cries quiet. Bring him some soup, she said, and handed over a container. And show him how to be useful loud. He nodded and took off down the block with a speed that made gravity jealous. The others followed at human pace, throwing glances back like they wanted to drag the moment a few steps further into their day. In the calm that followed, Wrench leaned against his bike and studied the sky the way mechanics do when they're listening for a noise they can't locate. Ledger, he said at last, looking at Magda. Magda reached into her pocket and came up with an envelope. Not thick, not showy. Paper the color of fair work. She held it out to Maris. For the week you lost, for the bills that don't wait, for the next person in this building who needs a hand you can't grow overnight. Maris stared at it as if it were a snake that had decided to be a rope. It's not charity, Magda said. It's arithmetic. You covered our night, we cover your 100 mornings. That's how we keep from owing the past more than we can pay. Maris took the envelope and felt its weight like a small shift in the earth under her feet. I'll use it where it becomes more of itself, not where it evaporates. Good, Wrench said, satisfied. You'll need to buy good coffee now. These people will expect it. They laughed. Magda's short and honest, Maris's surprised enough to sound like it had been living under the couch. The last of the riders pointed their machines toward the evening. Wrench swung into the saddle and looked up at the third-floor windows. Ivo popped his face into a square of glass and waved so hard he could have signaled a ship. Wrench saluted, 2 fingers to the brow, a gesture a boy could keep in his pocket for years and take out when bravery needed reminding. Magda stayed a beat longer. She ascended the stairs quietly and found Maris standing in the doorway with an expression like a weather report the sky had finally obeyed. I said we keep our ledgers clean. Doesn't mean we zero them. Means we pass the balance around until everybody's in the black. She glanced at Ivo. Teach him to ride something. Doesn't have to be a bike. Could be a hard day. Could be his own temper. Teach him to ride it, not to be dragged by it. I will, Maris said, and knew she meant it. They stood for a moment inside the small border of the threshold where outside and in negotiate custody. It felt like a hinge. Magda cleared her throat. One more thing, she said, awkward for the first time. We're doing a drive. Coats, canned goods, toys that don't require batteries. You don't have to come. But if you do, you bring a clipboard. Maris smiled at the caseworker in the hall, who flushed and pretended to be fascinated by a crack in the paint. We have one. We'll bring 2. Magda went, careless of the fact that some exits are entrances with their names turned around. The bikes rolled out in a ribbon, engines braiding together into one long sound that would visit Maris in sleep and remind her that sometimes rescue arrives noisy enough to argue with despair. When the lot fell quiet at last, the building exhaled. Neighbors retreated into homes with dinners to stir and stories to call across table edges. Elise hovered in Maris's doorway, the robe replaced by a sweater that understood how to be soft. "I said some things," she began. "You did," Maris said, not unkindly. Elise nodded, eyes shiny in a way she blamed on the draft. "I make casseroles," she blurted. "Good ones, with the crunchy onions?" "Bring two," Maris said, and that was absolution enough to keep them both upright. Night returned without teeth. The new heat turned the apartment into a place where shoulders didn't instinctively coil. Maris set Ivo at the table with crayons and a mission to design a thank you card with as many motorcycles as the corners of the paper would allow. She opened the envelope, quietly, respectfully, and found bills organized in 10s and 20s and a note in writing that surprised her by being careful as a thread through a needle. "For rent or a dream, your choice. M." She closed her eyes and pictured the two stacks those words suggested, the pile of problems that demanded to be fed now and the pile of maybes that could grow bones if someone believed in them long enough. "I want to start a pantry," she said out loud to the room that now felt brave enough to hold ideas. "Downstairs in the laundry space that no one uses right. Shelves, labels, a key everybody knows where to find and no one asks permission to touch." Yvonne looked up, green crayon in the air like a baton. "We can call it loud food because it shows up loud." He laughed. "We might." She reached for a notebook that had been bought for shopping lists but had secretly wanted to be a manifesto. She wrote, "Shelves. Ask church for old bookcases. Call Sunrise Co-op about bruised produce. Flyers in English and Spanish. Ask Miss Rada to be treasurer because nobody argues with her. Invite caseworker. Name." The caseworker cleared her throat from the hall where she'd lingered like a decision. "Lena, my name." "Lena," Maris repeated and wrote it down. Names were a kind of infrastructure, too. They worked until the clock proved the day had held more than it should and not broken. After Ivo fell asleep under a blanket that smelled faintly of leather and wind, Maris sat at the table and let silence be a kind of music. She allowed herself to picture the pantry with jars lined up like choir members, the building with a bulletin board that said, "Here are the hands, here are the needs, let them find each other in the middle." Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "This is Wrench, meeting is at the old roller rink on Spruce. Saturday, 10 a.m. If you want to bring the block, we'll clear a path." 2 minutes later, another, "And get a good lock for that pantry. The world is mostly good, but it has a leak." She smiled at the phone like a person who had learned to negotiate with fate. Then she typed, "Noted. We'll bring crunchy onions." Saturday came like a promise cashed. The roller rink had been repurposed into a community hall where Grease and Grace could shake hands without either washing up first. Long tables tottered under the weight of donations. Kids in hand-me-down pajamas skated slow circles in socks, while parents hauled boxes in lines that looked like choreography reunions. A banner someone had made from bedsheets and a can of spray paint read, "Winter is loud, be louder." Maris arrived with Ivo on one hand and a wagon on the other, trailed by a small army of neighbors carrying bags and casseroles. Elise marched at the front like an apology making itself useful. Ms. Rada wore a whistle around her neck like a medal. Lena signed forms and then ignored them when they got in the way of work. Marda met them at the door in a black beanie and a smile that allowed itself to be bright. "You brought clipboards," she observed, delighted like a gardener at Sprouts. "We brought 2, Maris said. The day throbbed with a rhythm that came from bodies doing the thing they were designed for, lifting, sorting, choosing, and handing off. Maris found herself in the middle without trying, her voice carrying further than it used to when anxiety had sat on it.
diapers here, canned goods to the left, produce in the shade, hot meals by the east wall because sun argues with steam. People listened not because she was loud, but because she made sense. At noon, Wrench climbed onto a milk crate and tapped a spoon on a thermos. The chatter settled. "Ledger," he began, and those who knew the word in his mouth smiled because they understood the math. "We don't do saints, we do balance. She covered us," he tipped his head at Maris, "and we covered back. That's not a favor, that's a system. Keep it moving."
He pointed at a whiteboard, now full of names under columns that read, "Bring, Fix, Watch, Call." If your name is under Bring, you load the van every Saturday until spring. If your name is under Fix, you answer when someone's heat coughs. Watch means you keep eyes out without making a circus. Call means you get on the phone and make paperwork behave. He paused, glanced at Lena, added, "Nicely." Laughter braided through the cold. Magda hopped up beside him without asking permission. "One more thing. We remember who started the thread. If you needed help today and you got it, your only job is to be the person who starts the next thread when it's your turn. That's it. That's the club." After the applause, she dropped down and found Maris, who was watching Evo teach a younger kid to stack cans so the labels made pictures when you stepped back. An accidental mural of tomatoes and hope. "You're good at this," Magda said. "I've been practicing on smaller canvases," Maris answered, looking toward the memory of her narrow kitchen. As the afternoon thinned, a woman in a tired coat approached the table with the last of the blankets. She had the look Maris recognized in mirrors and in the early morning bus window. A person making bargains with herself and calling them schedules. "My heat," the woman began, but the sentence broke into static. "We'll come," Maris said, surprising herself with the plural. She waved to Wrench, to Magda, to two teens and Lena. "Tonight, we'll bring soup. You bring the story of the radiator." They went. A caravan not of chrome this time, but of mismatched sedans full of tools and intention. The night produced what nights produce. Rusted valves, stripped screws, a landlord who answered only to numbers with currency attached. They coaxed the radiator into breathing. They taped a note to the landlord's door in handwriting that meant business. Maris stood in the blistered hallway and felt the floor tilt again, this time into the slope of possibility. On the way home, Magda walked beside her, hands jammed into her pockets against the cold. "The thing about ledgers," she said, "is they make people brave. They say do this instead of be good, and that's easier." Maris nodded. "I can do this." "You can. You did. You will." She stopped at the corner where their roads forked for the night. "One more thing." Maris waited. "Tomorrow we ride past your block slow, not to scare anybody, to make sure the story knows how to end." "How does it end?" Maris asked. "With the noise leaving when it's finished, and with you keeping the kind that stays." The next morning, Sunday, the bikes came through the cul-de-sac like a parade that refused floats. Engines low, speeds slower, heads lifted toward windows. They didn't stop. They didn't need to. They let the sound lay down a track and left the silence to carry it. Eva waved from the window with a sign he and Miss Rada had made from a pizza box. "Thank you. Loud food loves you." Elise leaned out of 3A and clapped with the fragile solemnity of a person new to the ritual. Lena stood on the stoop, arms crossed in a way that meant both satisfaction and, "I am writing this down so other people can learn how to do this." And Maris? She stood at the radiator and felt it hum under her palm like a living thing. She looked at the fridge, at a whiteboard she'd hung there with 4 sections now. Pantry, people, fixes, calls. The lists were already full of names in different hands. The building had, by some alchemy of noise and need, become a place that answered itself. She thought of the envelope, what remained after first choices and second thoughts. She wrote one more line on the dreams page of her notebook. Night classes, social work, HVAC, something that lets me be the person who shows up.
She didn't have to choose today. She had to choose to keep choosing. That she could do. When the apartment emptied of visitors and only familiar sounds returned, the heater with its new steady breath, the fridge with its occasional throat clearing, Evo narrating a dinosaur's apology to a traitorous volcano, Maris sat at the table and wrote a note for a door downstairs. Lounge Food opens Thursdays. Take what you need, leave what you can. If you can't leave anything, leave a favor you owe for later. She taped it beside the laundry room and stepped back. The hallway was quiet. It didn't feel empty. That evening, her phone vibrated once. A photo from Magda, Lark in a too-big fleece sleeper, cheeks apple bright, tiny fist punching the air like triumph. A second later, a voice memo. Magda's laugh in it like a heartbeat. "She's loud," she said. "You did that." She saved the photo to a folder she named Ledgers, then poured soup into 2 bowls and added crunchy onions on top because sometimes a joke becomes a tradition before it becomes a recipe. She and Evo ate at the table with the door cracked to listen to the building. It sounded alive. It sounded like a machine repaired and returned to its purpose. When the dishes were washed and stacked, when Evo fell asleep with green crayon on his fingers from all the motorcycles he'd drawn, when the lists on the fridge glowed in the kitchen light like small, brave constellations, Maris stepped to the window and looked at the quiet lot. She saw her own reflection, a woman whose ledger had shifted not to zero, but to a balance she could carry without bending. She thought, I will be here when the next knock comes, and I will have more to offer than a warm bathroom and a steady voice. I will have a building that knows what to do with itself. She closed the curtain. The radiator purred. The notebook waited open on the table, the page holding room for the next line.